On the subject that I'm actually supposed to be here for, they very kindly asked me to talk about blockchain doing wonderful things to the world and how blockchain can actually impact the world in a positive way. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So, 4 main areas where we feel that blockchain can really make a difference. And we've talked about some of these in different parts of the morning so far. Financial inclusion for me is the big first obvious one. It's what everybody talks about. Oh, I can send money effectively around the world without having to do wire transfers. Supply chain, identity management, energy and environment. So let's unpack those 4 a little bit. That bus, in parts of Africa, the most common way to transfer money across international borders is to give somebody a pile of banknotes and say, please give this to my sister over the border. Or give it to the bus driver and say, can you drop this off with my friend? Here's their name. They'll meet you when you park your bus. It's not the world's safest way of moving money, but it's the only practical way of doing it for large parts of Africa. We can't let that continue. There has to be a better way than giving a pile of money to somebody and hoping that they'll give it to the recipient at the end of the journey. Similarly, for people that are working abroad, often in, this is a picture of some people from Bangladesh that are working in UAE. When you work in a different country and you're working on a manual job, very often it's very difficult to get a bank account. And when you do get a bank account, you have to pay some fees. And then you want to send money back to your family in a country on the other side of the world when they will find it difficult to have a bank account. So now you're going to get a bank account and pay fees. You're going to send $100. It's going to go to a correspondent bank who's going to take a fee. They're going to send it to another correspondent bank who are then going to send it to your family's bank account that they've now just managed to open, or their friend's bank account to pass it through to you. And that $100 you sent is going to turn up as $72 to $85 between 7 and 14 days later. That's ridiculous. That means the people that need the money the most can't get the money when they actually need it. We can fix that by having money transmitted through various blockchains. Supply chain and provenance. If you're a farmer in Guatemala and you're producing coffee beans and you want to share those with the world, if you can prove the provenance of your supply from the time that it's actually grown and harvested and treated to the middleman, to the person that sells it to Starbucks, to the end consumer, if all that relates into one blockchain where you've got a permanent record of it, now you can actually make the supply chain work much more efficiently and you can reward those people that should actually be rewarded. It's one of the growth areas that will probably end up becoming practical the quickest because it has obvious financial benefits to lots of very major corporations. So that one's happening a lot. Obviously, if you're in Vancouver, it's more important that you know where your marijuana comes from. That's why there's so many pot-based blockchain companies going on. Identity. 230 million people under the age of 5 don't have any birth certificate or proof of their identity. If you don't have a birth certificate and you can't prove who you are, then you can't get education. You can't qualify for healthcare. You can't get into a school. If you get separated from your family, then there's no record of you. If there's a crisis, there's no one to look out for you. It's a very bad thing to have no identity. That's why there are global citizens, nationality unknown passports. And it doesn't matter whether you're in Africa. You could be born in former Yugoslavia. Former Yugoslavia breaks into lots of different places and lots of the records are burnt and then they don't exist. It can happen to people all over the world. 3% of children in Somalia under the age of 5 have a record of their birth. 97% don't. That's an absolute time bomb of young people in a very difficult situation waiting to happen in a disrupted country that's already at civil war and at war with itself and the world. There are many ways you can actually record information about a person on the blockchain. The midwife can put it in, the family can put it in, the people that are in the village can put it in. Different people can contribute to the blockchain to create a sovereign identity without having a government 75 miles away that you have to trek to in order to say this was my son or daughter. will make a huge difference to the world if we can start giving people a sovereign identity that moves with them. People sharing things. This is a group called Solmesh. They operate in Bangladesh and parts of India. And what they do is they put solar panels on people's roof, and then the power that you generate is recorded on the blockchain. The energy that you use is recorded on the blockchain. The excess power that you make can then be spread around the village and can be sold back into the grid so that you can supply other villages. So now you're actually making money for having a big panel on the roof. You can then fund that because you can look at all the metrics of how much power you generate and what happens to that power and how it's used. And you can then start purifying drinking water. You can start changing the economies of very remote, very rural villages that don't have access to the same kind of facilities that we take for granted. And the people in the orange shirts are the Solmesh team celebrating another village being connected. But, and I cannot lie, it's a big but. Thank you. Thank you for the person that got that. What if you don't have practical access to the internet? That's what RightMesh is really about. Not everybody does have access to the internet. If you live somewhere like India, where there's this many people waiting to get a train, and it's crowded, and the networks are overburdened, and the infrastructure is tired and falling apart, and people can't afford to pay more for it, then your connectivity is going to be really, really bad. And there's actually nobody on the roof of that train, which is most unlike the ones I see when I go to Bangladesh, because they've normally got dozens of people on the roof. Or if you're in a slum, a favela in Brazil, or this is a camp, it's not a refugee camp, it's where people have lived for 25 years in South Africa, or the very large slum that's in Nairobi, which has been there for 35 years, and is the second biggest in the world, where people live there for their entire lives, and they'll get some solar power, and they'll get a bit of electricity, and they'll get jobs, and they'll have real lives. But they're not going to get decent internet coverage. They're not going to get decent cell phone reception, even though they've got cell phones that they can afford to buy. Or this place. This is Rigolette. It's in northern Labrador. It's the southernmost Inuit community in the world. There's one internet connection point for the entire 300 people that live in this community. But it's a very ecologically sensitive area. The ice is melting, there are weather patterns, the hunting is changing, and there's lots of scientists trying to work out what's happening so they can actually prepare good science and report back on what's happening to this very, very fragile ecology and ecosystem. So they're putting lots of scientific instruments around. The problem is there's no internet for those to actually speak back and say, hey, here's my results. So we've been working with a project at University of Guelph for the past 2 years, and we've created a mesh in this area of Rigolette so that the scientists put all their instruments in and around, and then when somebody's going out and they're on their ski-doo and they go out following their normal hunting runs, the devices can just speak to the app on the people's phone over the mesh, and you go about your business, and then you go back into the village, and your phone says, oh, I'm near the access point, and it drops the information and puts it onto a box, and then the box can send it up when it gets internet access. So this entire area that was otherwise unconnected just gets connected because people have phones in their back pockets, and they go about doing their normal things, and the data can be data muled back without needing the internet, without needing to use data. It's been a really fun project. Getting there is quite interesting because it's plane, sometimes boat, and then a fair amount of walking through the snow. But it's beautiful. Or this is 4 members of our team plus a film crew in the Rohingya camp on the border between Myanmar and Bangladesh. So that's Joe, and he's our entrepreneur in residence, Rachel, one of our lead developers, Bree, who's our product manager for blockchain, John, our co-founder, who you heard from earlier, and Rakib, who runs our 90-person office in Bangladesh. And the film crew are doing a documentary about how blockchain can actually make a social impact on the world. So they're featuring us and Filecoin and Golem and OMG and a couple of other projects out there that are trying to do good. 1.1 million people. They've been persecuted for 30 to 40 years. They've been subject to mass genocide, brutality, absolutely horrible things happening to them, and they have no voice to the outside world because they have no connectivity. They have no way to share what they have. We've been seeing stories of people in the camp coming up to people with a cracked phone where you can hardly see the screen saying, I took some pictures and videos of what happened to my village, where people were locked in a house that was burnt, and absolutely terrible things that people have gone through, and they have no way of getting that out. If you have mesh connectivity, that can go from that person's phone to the film crew's phone to somebody else's phone. They come out, they can bring it with them. Now they can connect with the internet. Now the word can get out. We actually did an interview 3 days ago with one of the guys who's the main teacher in the camp, and he was in tears because he had heard that the Canadian government have declared the Myanmar government guilty of genocide and the fact that the crime should be reported to the International Court of Justice. And the gratitude of this guy, that people from outside were hearing about them and were able to make a difference in his life by saying that this is wrong and we want it investigated. He had tears streaming down his eyes. We sent the clip to CBC. It's actually on CBC, went up this morning. But the fact that you can make a difference with those things once you give people connectivity is what powers us and keeps us going. So connectivity is important. And it gets personal. So this is Jahid. Jahid is our driver in Bangladesh. So when we go out there, he drives us around because you don't want to drive in Bangladesh. It's a nightmare. It's honking horns. It's, oh, there's 2 lanes on this road, so we can go 5 cars wide. It's an absolute terrifying nightmare. And he keeps us safe. And he has a phone. And last time we were out there, we said, hey, Jahid, you've got apps on your phone. How'd you get those then? We said, did you get them from the Google Play Store? And he said, well, what's Google? Never heard of it. And he gets his app from that guy who's an internet seller, who has a little stand in a shopping center. And Jahid goes there and says, here's my phone. He pops out the SIM card. Guy puts it into his machine. He downloads some cricket highlights, a couple of songs, a few cached websites, a couple of games. He gives him 25 taka, which is about 35 cents. And that's his internet for the week. And Jahid is a really nice guy. But just as importantly, there's 4 billion people who lack reliable access to the internet. Now, don't get me wrong, 94% of people have access to the internet from time to time, according to Facebook. But it's not the internet that you and I think of, where you can say, oh, just download a file. No, it doesn't work like that. It's really, really small little bandwidth of files that cuts off all the time and dies when the power dies. According to PricewaterhouseCoopers and the report that they came out with about 18 months ago, if you could connect those 4 billion people, you could raise 500 million people out of poverty because you'd give them the tools that they need for healthcare so they can now be healthy and they can look after themselves, for education so they can learn to read and to write and to learn coding and to learn whatever they need, for economic information, for farming information, for all the things that we take for granted that we can look up in our digital economy. They can get those tools and they can drive themselves out of poverty. 6 million smartphones by 2020. People have access to smartphones. They're not $1,000 iPhone X's. They're $50 cheap in-market Android phones, but they work. And if you connect them correctly on the mesh, they work. And IoT, lots of IoT, cars, devices, nests, whatever. Less popular in emerging markets, but it's burgeoning and it's going to get bigger and bigger here. So all these people need connectivity, but it's actually quite easy, isn't it? We're getting 5G, that's coming to town. We've all got good connectivity. Why don't these people just get off their fat asses and give themselves some decent connectivity? Well, you can't. There's an economic black hole that happens, is that when the population doesn't have much money, they can't pay very much for data. If you can't pay very much for data, and we all assume that you don't make any money running a telephone service these days because nobody pays for calls, if you can't pay the telco very much for your data, then they can't get the investment money to make the systems better. If the infrastructure doesn't get better, then the reward for actually using that infrastructure is less powerful because it takes you too long to get anything, so you don't bother spending any of your hard-earned money, and you go down this spiral. And every time somebody puts in a huge amount of money and says, I'm going to put $1 billion into improving the infrastructure, all that happens is people start downloading videos and high files, and you go, big files, and you go back to square one. So The communications infrastructure in emerging markets is absolutely hooped. And you have to do it differently. And you have to do it through something that works differently. Our solution, our right mesh solution, is to cut out the middleman, have a mesh where you don't need to use the internet, you don't need to use your data, you don't have somebody sitting in the middle to listen to everything, and you can't do it with asking people to buy new hardware. We figure you have to do it with the phone that people have in their pocket and purely software. The no middleman is an interesting one, because if I want to send a WhatsApp message to Marie, at the moment it goes, my phone, Wi-Fi, cloud, WhatsApp servers in Texas, possibly the NSA, cloud, back to the cell phone tower, down to Marie. If it's a decent mesh, it should go, my phone, her phone. My phone can speak to the Wi-Fi router, so it can speak to her phone just as well. If a mesh is correctly set up, you don't need that person. You don't need ISP seeing absolutely everything you said and done to everybody if they choose to look at their records. Privacy is an increasingly important thing. Mesh networks help with that. This is the way it works. There's a mesh down at the bottom left-hand corner. There's a whole bunch of phones in it. The orange phones have absolutely no access to the internet or data. They might not have a SIM card. They're just a cheap $50 phone. But all those phones that are wired together in the mesh, or can hook together in the mesh, they can all speak to each other. And the green phones have access to the internet. So I could be a brown phone 3 steps away from being able to speak to the internet, but I can connect with the guy with the green phone, and I say, hey, if I give you 10 cents in right mesh tokens, would you send this text message to my friend in Abu Dhabi? He says, sure. He then touches a super peer, touches the internet, goes over to the next mesh, drops down, finds somebody in Abu Dhabi, passes it through to my friend. The idea of having a cryptocurrency in it, the reason why we're a blockchain-based company with a cryptocurrency, is you have to reward people for actually doing the right things. And that's what the right mesh cryptocurrency does. So where are we? We started in 2010 with John and myself meeting in Starbucks 3 mornings a week. We're now 130 people. We had our first off-grid application in 2014. It was designed by the guys in Bangladesh to solve their problem. We wrote a white paper on how we could really change it and create a big mesh that needed blockchain and needed its own currency. We produced massive white papers. One's 110 pages, one's 70. If any of you are technical or want to read the technical white paper, go ahead. It's on rightmesh.io. We had our own TGE, ICO by any other name, possibly one of the longest ones out there. It took us 14 months to do it because we wanted to be as compliant as possible. We launched on the mainnet, hopefully in the first quarter of 2019. We want to have 100 million nodes on the mesh by 2020, and we want to see a world connected. But what it all speaks back to is the point of doing this. And 2.5 years ago, we created a video which showed what we wanted to do and why. And I'll click to the video, and the video will tell you how it all works.
We like to dream big. So big that we dream of connecting every person on the planet. Yep, every single one of them. The problem is, most people cannot afford to connect. Data plans are too expensive. Mobile networks are slow and overburdened. Did you know? There are nearly 4 billion people for whom connectivity with the internet is not an option. While the rest of the world is experiencing a golden age of enlightenment, there are millions of unconnected people being left behind. We believe in the right to connectivity for all people, from students in Bangladesh to farmers in Colombia. People are now empowered. Empowered to share moments that matter. Empowered to connect and transact at high speeds for free and without investing billions in mobile infrastructure. It has been said, if you have an apple and I have an apple, and we each exchange apples, we still only have 1 apple each. But if you have an idea and I have an idea, and we exchange ideas, then we both have 2 ideas. We like that, because when you look at the people on this planet and what really matters, the right idea can connect the world.
So that's what we're about. Blockchain can do an awful lot for making this world a better place, but you have to be able to connect to do it. And exactly 20 minutes. So that's what we're trying to do. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, just shout.